She was locked in a wagon cage until the cowboy paid with his own horse. The sound of the lock turning was the loudest thing in the world. It echoed across the dirt street of Red Bluff, cutting through the afternoon heat and the murmur of voices gathered outside the general store. A woman sat behind iron bars inside a wooden cage mounted on a wagon, hands gripping the metal, knuckles white, face pressed close enough to see the world she couldn't touch. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair hung in dark tangles. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She only stared forward with eyes that had already given up. The man holding the key was tall and thin, with a crooked smile and a voice like gravel scraping glass. He called himself a traitor. The town called him something worse. He'd rolled into Red Bluff 2 days prior with 3 caged women and a price list written in ink that didn't smudge. The sheriff had looked the other way. The preacher had closed his church doors. And the townsfolk had gathered to watch, because watching was easier than acting. But then a cowboy stepped forward. He wasn't tall. He wasn't armed. He wore a hat with a brim frayed by years of sun, and a coat that had seen more dust storms than most men see in a lifetime. His boots were cracked leather, his face weathered and quiet. And beside him stood a mare, a chestnut horse with a white blaze down her nose and eyes so clear they looked like they held the sky. The trader saw him coming and grinned. "You got business with me, cowboy?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at the woman in the cage. She looked back. For a moment, the world went still. No wind. No voices. Just 2 people seeing each other across a distance that felt both infinite and paper-thin. "How much?" the cowboy asked. The trader laughed, a sound like stones rattling in a tin can. "For her? More than you got, friend. She's headed to a house in Abilene. Already paid for. Contract signed." "I'm not asking about the contract," the cowboy said, his voice low and steady. "I'm asking how much to buy her freedom." The crowd shifted. Whispers rose and fell like wind through dry grass. The trader's grin widened, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. He looked the cowboy up and down, taking in the threadbare coat, the empty gun belt, the worn saddlebags. Then his eyes landed on the mare. "That's a fine horse," the trader said slowly. The cowboy's jaw tightened. His hand moved to the mare's neck, fingers brushing through her mane. The horse turned her head slightly, nudging his shoulder the way she'd done 1,000 times before. She'd been born in his arms on a morning so cold the ground had cracked like glass. He'd fed her from a bottle when her mother died, taught her to trust his whistle, ridden her through deserts and mountains and storms that tried to break them both. She was the only living thing that had never left him. "She's not for sale," the cowboy said. The trader shrugged. "Then we got nothing to talk about." He turned back toward the wagon, keys jangling in his hand. The woman in the cage didn't move. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the bars. But something in her expression shifted, a flicker of hope dying before it could fully ignite. The cowboy closed his eyes. He felt the mare's warmth against his side, heard the soft rhythm of her breathing, remembered the way she'd carried him through a blizzard when he was half dead from fever, the way she'd stood guard over him during nights when loneliness felt like a weight pressing him into the earth. She wasn't just a horse. She was the only family he had. "Wait," he said. The trader stopped, turned, smiled. "The horse," the cowboy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For her freedom." Full and clear. The crowd went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The trader studied the cowboy's face, searching for doubt, for hesitation. He found none. "Deal," the trader said. The cowboy handed over the reins. The mare resisted at first, pulling back, her eyes wide and confused. She knew his smell, his voice, the way he moved. She didn't understand why he was letting go. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering words too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then he stepped back, and the trader led her away. The lock on the cage turned again. This time it opened. The woman climbed out slowly, her legs unsteady after days of confinement. She stood in the street, free but uncertain, like someone waking from a long and terrible dream. The cowboy didn't look at her. He couldn't. He watched the mare disappear down the road, her chestnut coat catching the late afternoon light, and felt something inside him crack open. The trader counted coins into a pouch and rode off without another word. The crowd dispersed, muttering and shaking their heads. They didn't understand. How could they? A man didn't trade his horse for a stranger. A man didn't sacrifice the only thing he loved for someone whose name he didn't even know. But the cowboy had. The woman stood in the dirt, staring at him. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask why. But the words wouldn't come. She saw the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands hung empty at his sides. She saw the grief in his eyes, raw and quiet and vast as the desert itself. Finally, she took a step toward him, then another. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the lines etched deep in his face. The dust settled in the creases of his coat. "Why?" she whispered. The cowboy looked at her then. Really looked. He saw the bruises on her wrists, the exhaustion carved into her features, the way she held herself like something fragile that had been broken too many times. He saw a person the world had tried to erase. "Because nobody should be caged," he said simply. She didn't respond. Couldn't. But something in her chest, something she thought had died long ago, stirred to life. It was small and fragile, like the first green shoot breaking through scorched earth. It was hope. The cowboy turned and started walking. No horse beneath him. No reins in his hands. Just his boots on the hard-packed road, and the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stay. Behind him, the woman watched. Then, without fully understanding why, she followed. They walked in silence through the dying town, past the saloon where men drank to forget, past the church where prayers went unanswered, past the sheriff's office where justice had turned its face away. No one stopped them. No one spoke. They were just two people moving through a world that had already decided they didn't matter. But they mattered to each other now, even if neither of them knew it yet. She touched the locket in her pocket and felt the metal burn against her fingers like a brand. They'd been walking for 3 hours when the sun finally gave up and sank behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of blood and ash. Her feet ached. Her throat was dry as dust. But she didn't ask to stop, didn't ask for water, didn't ask for anything at all. She'd learned long ago that asking only led to owing, and owing always came with a price she couldn't afford to pay. The cowboy walked ahead of her, his stride steady and unhurried despite the weight of what he'd lost. He carried a bedroll strapped across his back and a canteen that sloshed with each step. He hadn't spoken since they left Red Bluff, hadn't turned to check if she was following. But somehow she knew he was aware of her presence, the way a wolf knows when another creature shares its territory. Her name was Clara, though no one had called her that in months. In the town she'd left behind, they'd called her other things. Whore, burden, debt. Her brother had called her collateral when he'd sat across from a gambler in a smoke-filled saloon and bet everything he had on a hand that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. She'd been sleeping when the men came. They'd dragged her from her bed, thrown her in the back of a wagon, and driven through the night while she screamed until her voice gave out. The trader had explained it simply. She belonged to him now, bought and paid for. He'd transport her to Abilene, where a madam ran a house that catered to ranchers and railroad men. Clara would work there until the debt was settled. How long that would take, he couldn't say. Maybe a year, maybe 10, maybe forever. She'd spent 4 days in that cage, watching towns roll past like stations on a journey to hell. And then the cowboy had appeared. Clara still didn't understand it. Men didn't do things for nothing. Every kindness came with strings attached. Every act of mercy concealed a hook. She'd learned that lesson written in bruises and broken promises. So she walked behind him now, waiting for the moment when he'd turn and tell her what he wanted, what she owed, what she'd have to give to pay for her freedom. But the moment never came. When the light finally bled out of the sky, the cowboy stopped near a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind. He set down his bedroll and began gathering dried brush for a fire. Clara stood at a distance, watching. Her body tensed, ready to run if she needed to. But he didn't look at her, didn't speak, just worked in silence, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The fire caught quickly, flames licking at the darkness and pushing it back. The cowboy sat down on a flat stone and pulled the canteen from his belt. He took a drink, then held it out toward her without a word. Clara hesitated. She could see the offer in his outstretched hand, but she couldn't read the intention behind it. Was this charity? A test? The first payment on a debt she hadn't agreed to? "You should drink," he said quietly. His voice carried no command, no expectation, just a simple statement of fact. She stepped forward slowly, the way someone approaches a wild animal they're not sure they can trust. She took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever felt sliding down her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then turned his attention back to the fire. Clara sat down on the opposite side of the flames, as far from him as the circle of light allowed. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small. The night air was cold now, biting through the thin fabric of her torn dress. She shivered, but didn't move closer to the warmth. The cowboy reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of dried meat. He tore it in half and tossed one piece across the fire. It landed in the dirt near her feet. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and eating. It was tough and salty, but her stomach growled with gratitude. They sat in silence while the stars emerged one by one overhead, like witnesses to something they couldn't name. Clara kept stealing glances at the cowboy, trying to understand him. He had the look of a drifter, someone who'd been moving so long he'd forgotten what it meant to stay. His face was lined with years of sun and hardship. His hands were scarred and calloused. But his eyes, when she caught them in the firelight, held something she hadn't expected. Sadness. Not the bitter, angry kind that turned men cruel, but the deep, quiet kind that came from losing things that couldn't be replaced. What was her name? Clara asked suddenly. The question escaped before she could stop it. The cowboy looked up. "Who?" "Your horse." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His jaw tightened, and he looked away into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she almost missed it. "Juniper." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara felt something twist in her chest, a sharp, unexpected pain that had nothing to do with her own suffering. "She was beautiful," Clara said softly. "She was everything," the cowboy replied. The weight of those words settled over them like dust after storm. Clara understood then, with a clarity that cut through all her defenses, what he had given up for her. Not just a horse, not just transportation or companionship, but family. The only thing in the world that had loved him without condition or reservation. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You didn't know me. I could be anyone. I could be bad," he finished for her. He looked at her across the flames, his eyes steady and clear. "Could be. But that wasn't for me to judge. All I saw was someone who needed help." Clara felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough in that cage. Cried until her tears dried up and left only salt and emptiness behind. But these tears were different. They came from a place she'd thought was dead. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Creek." "Clara," she replied. "Clara Dawson." He nodded, acknowledging her the way someone acknowledges another human being. Not property, not cargo, not a debt to be collected, just a person. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the vast darkness. Clara reached into her pocket and felt the locket there. She'd carried it since the night they took her, a small oval of tarnished silver that had belonged to her mother. Inside was a photograph, so faded you could barely make out the faces. Her mother and father on their wedding day, young and hopeful and unaware of everything that was coming. Clara had kept it closed for months. Looking at it hurt too much. It reminded her of who she used to be before the world broke her down into something unrecognizable. But now, sitting across from this cowboy who'd traded everything for nothing, she pulled the locket out and opened it. The faces stared back at her in the firelight, ghostly and distant. She didn't cry, but she felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. Thomas didn't ask about the locket, didn't pry or push or demand explanations. He simply added another piece of brush to the fire and wrapped himself in his bedroll, giving her the space to exist without having to justify her existence. And for the first time since the cage, Clara felt something other than fear. She felt seen. Thomas woke to the sound of a whistle that wasn't there. His lips had formed the shape, the breath had left his lungs. But before the sound could fully emerge, he remembered. Juniper was gone. There was no chestnut mare to lift her head at dawn, no soft nicker in response, no warm breath against his palm. Just empty air and the ache of absence, so sharp it felt like a knife between his ribs. He sat up slowly, his body stiff from sleeping on hard ground. The fire had burned down to ash and ember. Across the dying coals, Clara still slept, curled on her side with her hands tucked under her chin like a child. The locket lay open beside her in the dirt, its tarnished surface catching the first gray light of morning. Thomas stood and walked away from camp, needing distance from his own grief. He climbed a small rise and looked out over the land stretching endlessly in all directions. Nothing but sage and stone and sky. This was the frontier that had raised him, the wilderness that had taken everything he'd ever loved and given nothing back except the lesson that love itself was the cruelest currency of all. Juniper had been born during a blizzard. Thomas had been working as a ranch hand in Montana, sleeping in a barn that barely kept out the cold. The mare's mother had gone into labor in the middle of the night, and something had gone wrong. The rancher had written her off, said she'd lose the foal and probably die herself. But Thomas had stayed. He'd knelt in the frozen straw and helped pull that foal into the world with his own hands, had cleared the birth sac from her nose and mouth, had rubbed her with burlap until her blood started moving and her lungs started working. The mother had died an hour later, but the foal had lived. Thomas had bottle-fed her every few hours, slept beside her in the straw, taught her to stand and walk and trust. The rancher had let him keep her as payment for the work, figured the foal wouldn't survive anyway without her mother. But she had. She'd grown strong and sure-footed, with a spirit that matched the wildness of the land itself. He'd named her Juniper because of the trees that grew twisted and stubborn on the mountainsides, surviving in places nothing else could. She'd been with him ever since. Through 10 years of drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, chasing work that dried up like creek beds in summer. Through nights so cold his breath froze in his beard and mornings so hot the ground blistered his hands. Through a bout of fever that should have killed him, when Juniper had stood over him in the shade of a canyon and refused to leave even when wolves circled in the dark. Through loneliness so profound it felt like drowning in an ocean of silence. She'd been his only constant, his only family, the only living thing that knew him completely and stayed anyway. And he'd traded her for a stranger. Thomas heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn. Clara climbed the rise and stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. Her hair was tangled, her dress still torn at the hem, but something in her posture had changed. She stood straighter. Less like prey, more like someone learning to remember she was human. "You miss her," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. They stood in silence while the sun began its slow climb above the horizon, turning the desert from gray to gold. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals invisible to the human eye. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out and received no answer. "Tell me about her," Clara said softly. Thomas closed his eyes. For a moment, he considered refusing. Talking about Juniper would make the loss real in a way it wasn't yet, would force him to acknowledge that she was truly gone. But Clara asked with such genuine care that he found himself speaking before he could stop. She was smarter than most people, he said. Knew when a storm was coming before the clouds showed. Knew when I was sad, without me saying a word. She'd come stand close and just be there. Not asking for anything. Just reminding me I wasn't alone. Clara listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. I found her on a frozen morning, Thomas continued, his voice rough with memory. Her mother died, bringing her into the world. I raised her on bottles and prayers, taught her everything I knew, and she taught me more. He paused, swallowing hard. She taught me that something could love you even when you had nothing to offer. Even when you were just a drifter with empty pockets and a heart that had forgot how to feel anything except tired. She was your family, Clara whispered. She was the only family I had. The weight of those words hung between them like smoke. Clara turned to look at him, then really look at him. She saw the grief carved into every line of his weathered face, the way his hands hung useless at his sides, the emptiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Then why, she asked, her voice breaking. Why would you give her up for me? You didn't know me. I'm nothing to you. You're not nothing, Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. He turned to face her, and for the first time since leaving Red Bluff, he met her eyes directly. That's the whole point. You're not nothing. You never were. Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I'm not worth what you paid. I'm not worth. Stop, Thomas said gently. You don't get to decide your own worth. Neither do the men who put you in that cage. Neither does your brother or that trader or anyone else who treated you like something they could buy and sell. Then who does? Clara asked desperately. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. Nobody, he said. Your worth isn't something that gets decided. It just is. You're a human being. That's enough. That's everything. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd spent so long believing she was worthless, believing she deserved everything that had happened to her, that hearing the opposite felt like a door opening in a room she'd thought had no exit. But Juniper, she started, was the best thing in my life, Thomas finished. And I'd make the same choice again. Because some things matter more than what we lose. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. But that doesn't make it the wrong choice. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at this cowboy who'd sacrificed his whole world for a stranger, and she understood something she'd never understood before. Goodness wasn't something you did when it was easy or convenient, or when you'd get something in return. Goodness was what you did when it cost you everything, when it broke your heart, when it left you walking through the desert on foot with nothing but grief for company. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry you lost her. Thomas nodded. Me too. They stood together on that rise as the sun climbed higher. Two people bound by an act of sacrifice, neither of them fully understood yet. Below them, the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. But somehow, standing there together, it felt a little less empty. We should keep moving, Thomas said finally. There's a town 2 days west. We can find work there. Start over. Clara looked at him with something like wonder. If you want, Thomas said. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. You're free now. You can go anywhere, do anything. But Clara realized she didn't want to go anywhere else. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because this man had shown her something she thought the world had lost, that kindness still existed, that sacrifice still mattered, that one person could still choose to do right even when it destroyed them. I'll come with you, she said quietly. If you'll have me. Thomas nodded once, then started back down the hill toward their camp. Clara followed, and as she walked, she felt something unfamiliar growing in her chest, something fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. It was the beginning of hope. Thomas collapsed in the doorway at sunset, his body shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Clara dropped the bucket she'd been carrying and ran to him, water spilling across the dirt floor of the small cabin they'd been renting for 3 months. His skin burned like desert stone at noon. His eyes were unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. She caught him before he hit the ground, his weight nearly pulling them both down. "Thomas," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "Thomas, look at me." But he couldn't. The fever had him in its grip, dragging him down into darkness. She managed to get him onto the narrow cot in the corner, pulling off his boots and covering him with every blanket they owned. His breath came in shallow gasps. Sweat soaked through his shirt. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him like a stove. This was how people died on the frontier. Not from bullets or rattlesnakes or outlaws, but from fevers that came on quick and burned through a body until there was nothing left but ash. Clara refused to let that happen. The town they'd settled in was called Redemption, though there was precious little of that commodity to be found. It sat at the edge of the territory like something the world had forgotten, a collection of weathered buildings and sun-bleached hopes scattered along a single dirt road. The creek that had once run through it had dried up 5 years ago. Most of the families had moved on, chasing water and opportunity elsewhere. The ones who stayed were too poor, too stubborn, or too broken to leave. Thomas and Clara had arrived in late summer, two drifters with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and a story no one asked them to tell. The town didn't care where they'd come from. It barely cared that they were there at all. They'd found work quickly. Thomas had skills with his hands, could fix a broken fence, patch a leaking roof, build furniture that didn't fall apart the first time someone sat on it. The ranchers and homesteaders who remained hired him for jobs they couldn't do themselves or couldn't afford to pay anyone else to do properly. Clara had taken work at the general store, sweeping floors and stocking shelves for a widow named Mrs. Hartley, who asked no questions and paid in food as often as coin. But what Clara really loved was the garden. Behind their small cabin sat a patch of earth everyone said was dead. The soil was hard-packed and gray, choked with rocks and roots from a tree that had died long ago. The previous tenant had tried to grow vegetables there and failed. Before that, someone else had tried and failed. The land had a reputation for refusing to give life. But Clara had looked at that soil and seen possibility. She'd spent weeks breaking up the earth with a rusted hoe, her hands blistering and bleeding. She'd hauled water from the town well until her back ached. She'd mixed in ash from their fire and scraps from a store that Mrs. Hartley let her take home. She'd planted seeds she traded for beans, squash, a few precious tomato plants, and watered them morning and night like they were children who needed tending. And slowly, impossibly, things had begun to grow. Green shoots had pushed through the gray soil. Vines had crawled along the ground. By autumn, they'd harvested enough vegetables to feed themselves and sell a little extra. Clara had felt something awaken in her during those months, something she thought had died in that cage. It was pride. Not the kind that made you arrogant, but the kind that came from building something with your own hands and watching it survive. Thomas had built them a table. Clara had sewn curtains from fabric Mrs. Hartley had given her. They'd created a home out of almost nothing, and it had felt like a miracle. But now, watching Thomas burn with fever, Clara felt that fragile miracle threatening to collapse. She stayed beside him through the night, changing the wet cloths on his forehead, trying to get him to drink water even though most of it dribbled down his chin. He muttered in his sleep, words she couldn't understand, names she didn't recognize. Once he called out for Juniper, his voice breaking with such raw grief that Clara had to look away. By dawn, the fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had gotten worse. Clara left him long enough to run to Mrs. Hartley's house. The old widow took one look at Clara's face and knew. "Fetch Dr. Morrison," Mrs. Hartley said, already reaching for her shawl. "We can't afford a doctor," Clara said desperately. "I didn't ask if you could afford it. I said fetch him." The doctor came, a tired man with kind eyes who'd seen too much death to promise miracles. He examined Thomas, gave Clara instructions for keeping him cool and hydrated, and left medicine he said might help but probably wouldn't. "It's up to him now," Dr. Morrison said quietly at the door. "And up to you. Don't let him give up." Clara nodded. even though she didn't know how to stop someone from giving up when they'd already lost everything that mattered. She returned to Thomas's side and didn't leave. She bathed his face and neck with cool water. She spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She talked to him even when he couldn't hear, telling him about the garden, about the first frost that had come last week and killed the tomato plants, about the plans she had for spring planting. 3 days passed. Then 4. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing her, sometimes lost in fevered dreams that made him cry out or thrash against the blankets. On the 5th night, when the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, Clara climbed onto the cot beside him. She wrapped her arms around his burning body and held him the way he'd held the mare that first day, with complete commitment, refusing to let go. "You don't get to leave," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not now. Not after everything." She thought about that moment in Red Bluff when he'd traded Juniper for her freedom. Thought about the way he'd walked away with nothing, giving up the only thing he loved for someone he didn't know. At the time, she thought it was about her, about saving her, rescuing her, some act of heroic charity that she could never repay. But she understood now that it wasn't like that at all. Thomas hadn't saved her. He'd chosen to see her humanity when everyone else had refused to. He'd chosen to act when action cost him everything. And in doing so, he'd reminded himself that he was human too, that he mattered, that his choices had meaning even in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. He'd needed to make that trade as much as she'd needed to be freed. They'd saved each other. "I see you," Clara whispered into the darkness. "The way you saw me." "I see you, Thomas. And you're not alone. Not anymore. Not ever." She didn't know if he heard her, but she kept talking anyway, her voice the only sound in the frozen night besides his labored breathing. She told him about her mother, about the locket, about the life she'd lost, and the life she was trying to build. She told him about the first morning she'd woken up in redemption and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She told him everything she'd been too scared to say when he was awake and could hear the tremor in her voice. And somewhere deep in the fever, Thomas held on. By dawn, something had shifted. His breathing came easier. The terrible heat began to fade from his skin. When Clara pressed her hand to his forehead, she felt the fever breaking, sweat cooling in the morning air. She stayed beside him, her body exhausted, but her heart lighter than it had been in days. Outside, the sun rose over Redemption, painting the dying town in shades of gold and amber. The garden lay dormant under frost, waiting for spring. The cabin was small and drafty and barely kept out the cold. But it was theirs. Thomas opened his eyes as the light strengthened. He looked at Clara with recognition, with clarity, with something that might have been gratitude or relief or simply the acknowledgement that they were both still here, still fighting, still alive. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Where else would I go?" He reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. She took it and held on, feeling the pulse beneath his skin, proof of survival, proof of resilience, proof that sometimes love wasn't a grand gesture or a sacrifice measured in horses and freedom. Sometimes love was just showing up, day after day, night after night, holding on when everything said to let go. Outside, Redemption woke to another cold morning. Inside the cabin, two people who'd lost everything began to understand what they'd found. It wasn't redemption, exactly. It wasn't salvation or absolution or any of the big words preachers used in churches. It was simpler than that, and infinitely more precious. It was home.